The storm rolled in like a judgment from heaven itself, turning the New Mexico sky the color of a fresh bruise and sending Dorothy Edwards scrambling for shelter where there was none to be found. She'd been on the stagecoach from Santa Fe to Albuquerque that afternoon in the summer of 1878, her worldly possessions tied in 2 worn carpetbags at her feet when the driver had spotted the riders. "Bandits!" he'd shouted, and in the chaos that followed, Dorothy had done the only thing she could think of: she'd run. Now, 2 hours later, with darkness falling and the wind howling like a wounded animal, she was hopelessly lost in the high desert country, her fine Boston shoes torn to ribbons, and her dress plastered to her skin by the first fat drops of rain. Lightning split the sky, and in its brief illumination, she saw it alight in the distance, warm and steady against the storm's fury. Dorothy didn't consider the dangers of approaching a stranger's home in this wild territory. She simply ran toward that light like it was salvation itself, her lungs burning and her legs threatening to give out beneath her. The rain came in earnest then, a deluge that soaked her to the bone in seconds and turned the hard, packed earth to mud that sucked at her ruined shoes with every step. She was nearly at the ranch house when she stumbled, going down hard on her hands and knees in the mud. For a moment she simply stayed there, exhausted and frightened and so far from everything she'd ever known. Then the door opened, and a man's voice called out over the storm. "Who's there?" "Show yourself." Dorothy tried to stand, slipped, and found herself sitting in the mud like a child. "Please," she called back, her voice breaking. "Please, I need help." The man emerged from the doorway with a lantern held high, and even through the driving rain Dorothy could see he was tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the kind of easy confidence that spoke of a life lived outdoors. He reached her in 4 long strides, setting the lantern down and offering his hand without hesitation. "Can you stand?" His voice was rough but not unkind, tinged with an accent she couldn't quite place. "I think so." She took his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip as he pulled her upright. Up close, she could see he was perhaps 30, with dark hair plastered to his forehead by the rain and eyes that were studying her with concern rather than suspicion. "Come on, then. Let's get you inside before this storm gets any worse." He grabbed the lantern and kept hold of her arm, guiding her toward the house as lightning cracked overhead so close she could smell the ozone in the air. The ranch house was modest but well built, and the moment they crossed the threshold Dorothy felt the difference. It was warm and dry, lit by oil lamps that cast golden pools of light across rough-hewn furniture and Navajo rugs. The man shut the door firmly behind them, cutting off the storm's roar to a dull thunder. "You're bleeding." He gestured to her hands torn from her fall. "And you look half drowned. Stay right there, I'll get some towels." Dorothy stood dripping on the wooden floor, suddenly aware of what a sight she must be covered in mud, her dark hair hanging in wet ropes down her back, her traveling dress ruined beyond repair. She was still shaking, though whether from cold or delayed fear she couldn't say. The man returned with an armful of towels and what looked like a woman's dressing gown. "Bathroom's through there," he said, pointing to a door. "Get out of those wet things before you catch your death. There's a basin and clean water. Take your time." "Thank you," Dorothy managed. "Thank you so much. We'll talk after you're warm and dry," he said, his voice gentling. "Go on now." The bathroom was small but clean, with a copper tub and a washstand holding a pitcher of water. Dorothy stripped out of her sodden clothes with shaking hands, using the towels to dry herself as best she could before slipping into the dressing gown. It was too large, clearly meant for a bigger woman, and she had to roll the sleeves up twice. But it was warm and soft, smelling faintly of cedar. When she emerged, the man had set a kettle on the cook stove and was pulling down mugs from a shelf. He changed too, she noticed, into dry-clothes dark trousers and a blue work shirt that made his eyes look almost gray in the lamplight. "Better?" he asked. "Much. Thank you, mister." She trailed off, realizing she didn't know his name. Orion. Xavier Orion, but most folks just call me Xavier. He poured hot water over tea leaves in both mugs, then gestured to the table. "Sit down before you fall down." Dorothy sank gratefully into one of the wooden chairs, accepting the mug he offered with both hands. The heat felt wonderful against her palms, and the first sip of tea warmed her from the inside out. Xavier took the chair across from her, his own mug cradled in his large hands, and waited. "My name is Dorothy Edwards," she began. "I was on the stage from Santa Fe when we were attacked. The driver shouted about bandits and everyone scattered. I ran and kept running until I was lost, and then the storm came." The words tumbled out in a rush, and she found herself blinking back tears. "I don't even know where I am." "You're about 15 miles north of Socorro," Xavier said. "This is the Triple O Ranch, been in my family since my father settled here in '62. As for the stage, I haven't heard anything but in this storm." He shook his head. "Communication's going to be difficult until it passes. Could be tomorrow, could be 2 days from now." Dorothy's stomach sank. "I have to get to Albuquerque. I have a position there, teaching at a new school. They're expecting me in 3 days." "Well, you're welcome to stay here until the storm breaks and we can figure out how to get you where you need to go," Xavier said. "It's not much, but you'll be safe and dry. I couldn't impose." "It's not imposing if I'm offering." He took a sip of his tea, studying her over the rim of his mug. "Besides, my mother raised me better than to turn away someone in need, especially in a storm like this." "Your mother?" Dorothy glanced around, suddenly worried there was a woman of the house she was offending with her presence. "Died 2 years back," Xavier said simply. "It's just me here now and my ranch hands, but they bunk in the building out past the barn. You'll be safe enough, Miss Edwards. I give you my word on that." There was something in his steady gaze that made her believe him. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't seen your light. Lucky for both of us you did." He finished his tea and stood. "You must be hungry. I've got some stew left from dinner. It's not fancy, but it's hot." Dorothy realized she was famished. "That sounds wonderful." Xavier ladled stew into a bowl and set it before her with a chunk of bread. It was simple fare beef and vegetables in a rich broth, but it was the best thing Dorothy had tasted in days. She ate slowly, trying to maintain some semblance of manners despite her hunger, while Xavier busied himself banking the fire in the stove and checking that the windows were secure against the storm. "Your bags," he said suddenly. "Did you have anything with you when you ran?" Dorothy's heart sank. "2 carpet bags. They were on the stage. I suppose they're long gone now." "Might be, might not. We'll see what we can find out once the weather clears." He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture that spoke of weariness. "For tonight you can take the bedroom. I'll bunk out here on the sofa." "I can't take your bed," Dorothy protested. "You can and you will," Xavier said firmly. "The bedroom's warmer and you've had a hell of a day. Don't argue with me on this." There was something almost protective in his tone that made Dorothy's throat tight. In Boston, she'd been used to society's careful distance, to interactions hedged around with propriety and cold politeness. This rough rancher's straightforward kindness was something entirely different, and it touched her more deeply than she wanted to admit. "Thank you, Mr. Orion," she said softly. "Xavier," he corrected. "If you're going to be staying under my roof, even for a short while, we might as well be on a first-name basis. Unless you're uncomfortable with that. No, it's fine. And please call me Dorothy." He smiled then, a real smile that softened his weathered features and made him look younger. "All right then, Dorothy. Let me show you where things are." The bedroom was simple but comfortable, with a large bed covered in a patchwork quilt, a dresser with a mirror, and a window that looked out onto the storm-dark plains. Xavier lit the lamp on the nightstand and checked that there were extra blankets in the chest at the foot of the bed. "If you need anything, just holler," he said. "I'm a light sleeper." "I'll be fine," Dorothy assured him. "Thank you again, for everything." Xavier nodded and left, closing the door softly behind him. Dorothy sat down on the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the day's events. This morning she'd been a properly dressed schoolteacher heading to her new position, full of hope and nervous excitement. Now she was stranded on a stranger's ranch in the middle of a storm, wearing a borrowed dressing gown, and with no idea what tomorrow would bring. But as she lay down beneath the quilts and listened to the storm rage outside, she felt something she hadn't expected. She felt safe. Dorothy woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee brewing. For a moment she was disoriented, not recognizing the room, and then the events of the previous day came flooding back. She sat up quickly, pushing her tangled hair out of her face, and realized she'd slept in the dressing gown. A soft knock came at the door. "Dorothy, you awake?" "Yes," she called back. "I've got coffee when you're ready. And I found some of my mother's old dresses in a trunk. They might fit you well enough until we can sort out your things." Dorothy opened the door to find Xavier holding a neat stack of folded clothing. In the daylight, she could see him more clearly. He was handsome in a rugged way, with sun-weathered skin and fine lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of long days spent squinting into the distance. His dark hair was still damp from washing, and he'd shaved, revealing a strong jaw. "That's very kind," she said, taking the clothes. "Is the storm over?" "Mostly. Still some wind, but the rain stopped about an hour ago. Ground's going to be mud for days, though." He paused. "I sent one of my hands into Sakuro to see if there's any news about the stage. Should know something by this afternoon." "Thank you." Dorothy looked down at the dresses in her arms. "I'll just get changed." Xavier nodded and headed back toward the kitchen, and Dorothy closed the door to dress. The garments were old-fashioned, probably 15 years out of date, but they were clean and well-made. She chose a simple brown calico with a fitted bodice and full skirt, pleased to find it fit reasonably well, though she had to roll the hem up a bit. There was a comb on the dresser, and she used it to work through her tangled hair, braiding it into a simple plait down her back. When she emerged, Xavier was at the stove frying eggs. The main room looked different in daylight, cozier somehow, with worn furniture that spoke of long use rather than poverty. Books lined a shelf near the fireplace, and there were framed photographs on the mantel. Through the window she could see the land stretching away in all directions, rolling high desert grassland dotted with scrub and the occasional twisted juniper. "It's beautiful," she said without thinking. Xavier glanced up from the eggs. "Most folks from back east think it's desolate." "It is desolate," Dorothy agreed, "but there's something about it, all that space, that sky." She moved to the window, looking out. "In Boston, everything's cramped and close. Here you can breathe." "That's why my father settled here," Xavier said. "He was from Ohio originally, came west after the war, said he needed room to think." He slid eggs onto 2 plates and added bacon and biscuits. "Come eat." They sat across from each other at the table, and Dorothy found herself studying him more openly in the daylight. There was a quietness to Xavier, a sense of self-containment that she found intriguing. He didn't fill the silence with idle chatter, seemed comfortable letting it stretch. "How long have you been running this ranch alone?" she asked. "Since my mother passed." My father died 5 years ago, and I've been helping run things since I was old enough to sit a horse, so it's not like I don't know what I'm doing. But it's a lot of work for one man, even with the hands I employ." He took a sip of coffee. "What made you decide to come out here to teach?" Dorothy considered how much to tell him. "My parents died last year within a month of each other. Influenza. Without them, there was nothing keeping me in Boston except debts and bad memories. When I saw the advertisement for teachers needed in New Mexico territory, it seemed like a chance to start fresh." "That's brave," Xavier said. "Coming all this way alone, or foolish," Dorothy said with a slight smile. "I'm beginning to think I didn't fully appreciate what I was getting into." "The territory can be rough," Xavier admitted, "but it can also be good to you if you give it a chance. People out here, they don't much care where you came from or what your family name is. They care about whether you're honest and whether you pull your weight." There was something appealing about that philosophy, so different from Boston's rigid social hierarchies. Dorothy found herself relaxing, the knot of anxiety that had been tight in her chest since yesterday beginning to ease. They were finishing breakfast when the sound of hoofbeats announced a rider approaching. Xavier went to the door, Dorothy following cautiously behind. A young man dismounted from a bay horse, his expression grim. "Boss, I got news from Sakuro," he said, then noticed Dorothy and swept his hat off. "Madam, this is Pete Santos, one of my hands," Xavier said. "What did you find out?" "Stage was robbed, just like the lady said. Driver's dead, shot by the bandits. 2 passengers made it back to Sakuro, but they said there was a woman who ran off and they haven't found her yet. Sheriff's got a search party out looking." Dorothy felt the blood drain from her face. The driver was dead. She'd heard him shout, had heard gunfire as she ran, but somehow she'd convinced herself everyone would be all right. The reality was suddenly, horribly clear. "I'm sorry," Xavier said quietly, and she realized he'd moved closer, his hand on her elbow steadying her. "Pete, can you ride back and let the sheriff know Miss Edwards is here and safe? Tell him we'll bring her into town when the roads are passable." "Will do, boss." Pete nodded to Dorothy. "Glad you're safe, madam. You were mighty lucky to find the O in that storm." After he'd ridden off, Xavier guided Dorothy back inside and pressed her into a chair. "Put your head down if you feel faint." "I'm all right," Dorothy managed, though her hands were shaking. "That poor man. And I just ran." "You did what anyone would do in that situation," Xavier said firmly. "If you'd stayed, you might be dead too. You can't blame yourself for that. I should have done something." "What? You're a school teacher, not a gunfighter." He pulled a chair close and sat facing her, his expression serious. "Listen to me, Dorothy. This is hard country and bad things happen, but you survived and that matters. Don't carry guilt for that." His words made sense, but the shock of it all was still settling over her. Xavier seemed to understand, because he didn't push her to talk. Instead, he brought her more coffee, and then quietly went about his morning chores, giving her space to process. Dorothy watched him through the window as he moved around the ranch yard, checking on horses, talking with 2 other ranch hands who'd appeared. He moved with an easy confidence, clearly at home in this world in a way she couldn't imagine ever being. And yet he'd been nothing but kind to her, a complete stranger who'd literally stumbled out of the storm. By afternoon, Dorothy felt steadier. She'd helped Xavier prepare a simple dinner. He'd been surprised, but pleased by her competence in the kitchen, and they'd fallen into an easy conversation about inconsequential things. He told her about the ranch, about the challenges of raising cattle in the high desert. She told him about teaching, about her love of literature and history. "I always thought I might like to read more," Xavier admitted as they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sun paint the western sky in shades of orange and gold. But time gets away from me. There's always work to be done. What kind of books do you like? Dorothy asked. I'm partial to history myself. And poetry, though I know that's not what most folks would expect from a rancher. He looked almost embarrassed. My mother loved poetry. She used to read to me when I was young. What was her name? Dorothy asked softly. Maria. Maria Cruz before she married my father. She was from a family that had been in New Mexico since the Spanish colonial days. Met my father when he was working on a ranch near Albuquerque. Xavier's expression was distant, remembering. He said he knew from the first moment he saw her that she was going to change his life. That must have been difficult for them, an Anglo man and a Hispanic woman back then. It was, Xavier said. Her family disowned her. His family back in Ohio wanted nothing to do with her. But they didn't care. They had each other, and that was enough. He paused. That's why my last name is Orion, but I have my mother's coloring. People sometimes assume things, but I'm proud of both sides of my heritage. Dorothy understood what he wasn't saying, that being mixed heritage in the territory meant navigating careful lines, being not quite accepted by either community. They sound like they were very much in love, she said. They were, right up until the day she died. Xavier's voice was rough. I want that someday. That kind of partnership, that certainty. But it's hard to find out here. Most women who come west are already spoken for, and the ones who aren't tend to take one look at the isolation and run back to wherever they came from. Dorothy thought about that as she looked out at the endless landscape. She'd been terrified yesterday, desperate for shelter. But today, sitting on this porch with the evening breeze cooling her skin and the vast sky overhead, she felt something different. She felt possibility. I think some women might surprise you, she said quietly. Xavier looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them in that moment. It was too soon, too fast, but Dorothy couldn't deny what she felt, a pull toward this quiet, capable man who'd opened his home to her without question. The moment was broken by Pete Santos riding up again. Boss, Sheriff Dawson's coming out tomorrow to talk to Miss Edwards about the robbery. Wants to know if she can identify any of the bandits. Tell him that's fine, Xavier said, standing. We'll be here. After Pete left, Xavier turned to Dorothy. You don't have to be afraid. Sheriff Dawson's a good man. He'll want your statement, but he won't push you. I'll tell him what I can, Dorothy said. Though I'm not sure how much help I'll be. Everything happened so fast. They went inside as darkness fell, and Xavier lit the lamps while Dorothy began cleaning up from dinner. It felt strangely domestic, this easy companionship, and she found herself not wanting the evening to end. But eventually Xavier showed her to the bedroom again, and she found herself alone with her thoughts. She should be anxious, she knew. She was stranded at a strange man's ranch. Her belongings were missing, and she'd witnessed a crime. But instead, lying in the comfortable bed with the sound of the wind outside, she felt oddly content, safe in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. Sheriff Dawson arrived mid-morning the next day, a weathered man in his 50s with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense manner. Xavier offered him coffee, and they all sat at the kitchen table while the sheriff took out a notebook and pencil. Miss Edwards, I'm sorry about your ordeal, he began. I know this is difficult, but I need you to tell me everything you remember about the robbery. Dorothy took a deep breath and recounted the events, the sudden appearance of the riders, the driver's shout, the gunfire. I didn't see their faces clearly, she admitted. I was too frightened, and it all happened so quickly. How many were there? Dawson asked. 4, I think. Maybe 5. They wore bandanas covering their faces. Did you hear them say anything? Notice anything distinctive about them or their horses? Dorothy closed her eyes, trying to remember. One of them had a distinctive laugh, high-pitched, almost like a cackle, and one of the horses was a paint black and white. Dawson wrote this down. That's helpful. There's a gang been operating in the area, could be them. He looked up at her. I have to ask, Miss Edwards. What are your plans now? I need to get to Albuquerque, Dorothy said. I have a position at the school there. The school year doesn't start for another month, Dawson pointed out. And frankly, traveling alone right now might not be the safest option, not with that gang still out there. Xavier, who'd been quiet until now, spoke up. She's welcome to stay here until it's safer to travel. Dorothy turned to him, surprised. I couldn't impose on you for that long. It's not imposing, Xavier said, his tone brooking no argument. You need somewhere safe to stay. I have room, and we could use an extra pair of hands around here. My mother's garden has been neglected since she passed. If you're willing to work, you'd be earning your keep. I can pay you, Dorothy began, but Xavier shook his head. Keep your money for when you get to Albuquerque. This isn't about payment, it's about doing what's right. Sheriff Dawson nodded approvingly. That's settled then. Miss Edwards, I'll send word to Albuquerque about what happened, and I'll let you know if we catch those bandits. Xavier, you take care now. After the sheriff left, Dorothy faced Xavier. You really don't have to do this. I know I don't have to, I want to. He met her eyes. The truth is, it'll be nice to have someone else around the place. Gets lonely sometimes, just me and the hands. And I meant what I said about the garden. My mother put years into that plot, and I hate seeing it go to waste. Then I accept, Dorothy said, and I'll work hard, I promise you that. I know you will. Xavier smiled, and Dorothy felt her heart do an odd little skip. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Dorothy woke early and helped Xavier prepare breakfast for the ranch hands. After they'd eaten and headed out to their work, she tackled the garden with a determination that surprised her. It had indeed been neglected, overrun with weeds and dried out from lack of water. But underneath the neglect she could see the careful planning rows where vegetables had once grown, an herb garden near the house, even a few struggling rose bushes. Xavier had shown her where the well was and how to work the pump, and she'd spent hours hauling water to the thirsty plants. Her hands blistered and her back ached, but there was something deeply satisfying about the work. By the end of the first week, she could see real progress. Xavier noticed too. You're bringing it back to life, he said one evening, standing with her at the edge of the garden plot. My mother would have liked that. I like working with growing things, Dorothy admitted. In Boston, I had a small window box, but this is something else entirely. They'd grown comfortable with each other over the past week, the initial awkwardness fading into an easy companionship. Xavier taught her about the ranch, showing her how to feed the chickens and collect eggs, how to tell if a horse was favoring a leg, even how to recognize the different plants that grew wild on the range and which ones were useful versus poisonous. Dorothy, in turn, had begun reading to him in the evenings. They'd discovered a shared love of adventure stories, and she'd found a worn copy of Treasure Island on his bookshelf. Now, after dinner, they'd sit on the porch and she'd read aloud while he repaired tack or whittled, the comfortable silence between chapters as pleasant as the reading itself. You have a good voice for reading, Xavier said one night. Clear and expressive. Those students in Albuquerque are going to be lucky to have you. The mention of Albuquerque made Dorothy's stomach clench oddly. She'd almost forgotten that this was temporary, that she had a life waiting for her elsewhere. The realization was unsettling. Xavier, she said slowly. Can I ask you something? Of course. Do you ever wish you'd done something different with your life? Gone somewhere else, been someone else? He was quiet for a moment, his hands stilling on the leather strap he'd been working. Sometimes, he admitted. When I was younger, I used to dream about seeing the ocean. My father told me stories about it. He'd come west by ship through Panama, and I thought it sounded incredible. But then he died and the ranch became my responsibility, and that dream sort of faded. He looked at her. Why do you ask? I was just thinking that a month ago I was so certain about what I wanted. Teaching in Albuquerque, starting fresh, building a new life. But now, she trailed off, unsure how to finish. Now you're not so certain. Xavier's voice was gentle. Now I'm not sure what I want, Dorothy confessed. Being here, it's different than I expected. I thought I'd feel trapped, isolated, but I don't. I feel like I can breathe for the first time in years. The territory has a way of getting under your skin, Xavier said. Either you hate it and leave, or it becomes part of you. Which one am I, do you think? He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the twilight. I think you already know the answer to that. 2 weeks into her stay, a wagon arrived from Socorro bearing Dorothy's carpetbags. The sheriff had sent word that they'd been recovered from the abandoned stagecoach, and one of the shop owners had been kind enough to bring them out to the ranch. Dorothy unpacked her belongings with mixed feelings. The dresses and books, the few precious photographs and letters, they all seemed to belong to a different person, someone who'd existed in another life. She hung the dresses in the wardrobe next to the borrowed calico she'd been wearing, but found herself reaching for the simple work dress more often than her finer things. She did take out one item with reverence, though a small leather-bound volume of poetry that had belonged to her mother. That evening, instead of Treasure Island, she showed it to Xavier. My mother loved poetry too, she said softly. She used to read to me before bed. Emily Dickinson, Walt Whitman, Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Would you read me something? Xavier asked. Dorothy paged through until she found one of her favorites, Browning's How Do I Love Thee. As she read the familiar words, she was acutely aware of Xavier's gaze on her, of the emotion in the verses taking on new meaning. When she reached the final line, I shall but love thee better after death, her voice caught slightly. That's beautiful, Xavier said quietly. That kind of love, that depth of feeling, that's what my parents had. What about you? Dorothy asked before she could stop herself. Have you ever been in love? Xavier was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally he said, I thought I was once. Girl named Sarah from Socorro. We courted for about 6 months and I thought we might marry. But when I brought her out here, showed her the ranch and what life would be like, she couldn't handle it. The isolation was too much for her. She married a shop owner's son instead. He paused. I was hurt at the time, but looking back, I'm glad. If she couldn't love this place, couldn't love this life, then we weren't right for each other. You need someone who understands, Dorothy said. I need someone who wants to build something with me, Xavier corrected. This ranch, it's not just where I live. It's my legacy, what my parents worked for. I need a partner who sees that, who wants to be part of it. The intensity in his voice made Dorothy's heart race. That's not too much to ask, she said softly. Isn't it? Xavier looked at her. Most women want security, comfort. This life, it's hard work and long days, and sometimes things go wrong. It takes a special kind of person to choose this willingly. Or maybe it takes someone who's tired of security and comfort, Dorothy said. Someone who wants something real. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken words. Xavier leaned forward slightly, and for a moment Dorothy thought he might kiss her. Her breath caught in anticipation. But then Pete Santos called out from the yard, something about a horse with colic, and the moment shattered. Xavier stood quickly. I should go see to that. Of course, Dorothy managed, though her heart was still pounding. She watched him stride across the yard, his figure disappearing into the barn, and pressed her hand to her chest. This was dangerous territory she was entering, letting herself feel this way about Xavier. She barely knew him, had been here less than 3 weeks. And yet she couldn't deny what was growing between them, a connection that felt deeper and more real than anything she'd experienced in her 23 years. That night, lying in bed, Dorothy forced herself to think practically. She had a position waiting for her in Albuquerque, a chance to use her education and skills to make a real difference. That had been her plan, her fresh start. Could she really consider giving that up for a man she'd just met, for a life she'd stumbled into by accident? But was it really by accident? The thought came unbidden. She could have found shelter elsewhere, could have been taken in by any number of people. But the storm had brought her here to Xavier, to the Triple O Ranch. Maybe there was meaning in that. The next morning dawned clear and bright, and Xavier announced they were going to ride out to check on the cattle in the far pasture. "If you're up for it," he added. "It's a fair distance." "I'd like that," Dorothy said, eager for a distraction from her churning thoughts. Xavier saddled 2 horses, a gentle mare named Sage for Dorothy and his own gelding, a striking bay called Thunder. Dorothy hadn't ridden much, but she found she had a natural seat, and Sage was patient with her inexperience. They rode out across the grassland, the morning sun warm on their faces. Xavier pointed out features of the land, a dry wash where flash floods could appear in minutes during storms, a grove of cottonwoods that marked the location of a spring, the distant mountains that formed the horizon. "This is all yours?" Dorothy asked, awed by the vastness of it. "About 2,000 acres, Xavier confirmed. "Not the biggest spread around, but it's enough to support a decent herd. My father was careful about water rights when he settled here. That's what makes or breaks you in this country, water." They found the cattle grazing peacefully, and Xavier spent some time checking them over, looking for signs of disease or injury. Dorothy watched him work, admiring his competence, the gentle way he handled even the most skittish animals. "You really love this, don't you?" she said. "It's in my blood," Xavier replied. "Can't imagine doing anything else." He swung back into the saddle. "Come on, I want to show you something." He led her to a rise that overlooked a small valley, and there, tucked into a fold of land near the cottonwood grove, was a house. Or rather, the beginning of one. A foundation had been laid, and the framing for the walls was partially complete, but the structure was clearly unfinished. "What is this?" Dorothy asked. Xavier dismounted and helped her down from Sage. "This was supposed to be a new house. My father started it the year before he died, said the old house was fine for a bachelor, but if I was going to find a wife and raise a family, I'd need something bigger. We worked on it together that summer, made good progress. But then he got sick, and after he died." Xavier shrugged. "I couldn't bring myself to finish it. Didn't see the point without someone to share it with." Dorothy walked through the skeletal structure, imagining what it could be. The placement was perfect, sheltered from the worst winds, close to water, with a view that stretched for miles. She could see where the rooms would be, could picture windows looking out onto the valley. "It's beautiful," she said. "Or it will be. Maybe someday," Xavier's voice was wistful, "when I find the right person." Dorothy turned to face him and found him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. "Xavier, I know this is fast," he said, cutting her off. "I know you've only been here a few weeks and you have plans and a whole life ahead of you, but I can't pretend anymore, Dorothy. I can't pretend I don't feel what I feel." Her heart was hammering. "What do you feel?" "I feel like that storm didn't bring you here by accident," Xavier said, closing the distance between them. "I feel like I've been waiting for you without even knowing it. These past weeks, having you at the ranch, watching you bring my mother's garden back to life, sitting with you in the evenings, it's been the happiest I've been since before my parents died. And the thought of you leaving, going to Albuquerque, never seeing you again." He shook his head. It's like contemplating losing something precious I only just found. Dorothy's eyes were stinging with tears. I feel it too, she whispered. God help me, I feel it too, but I'm afraid. I don't know if I'm strong enough for this life, if I can be what you need. You already are, Xavier said, reaching out to cup her face in his calloused hands. Dorothy, you're one of the strongest people I've ever met. You survived an attack, found your way through a storm, and instead of falling apart, you picked yourself up and started working. You've got courage and determination and a good heart. That's all I need. That's everything. What about teaching? Dorothy asked. I have a contract. Then we'll write to them, explain the situation. Maybe there's a school closer by that needs a teacher. Sakura has children who need education too. Or maybe we could start something here on the ranch. There are families scattered all over these hills, and their children deserve to learn. Xavier's thumbs brushed away her tears. Dorothy, I'm not asking you to give up who you are. I'm asking you to build a life with me, to be my partner in all things. That includes your dreams too. You really mean that? I do. His voice was fervent. I want to finish that house with you. I want to watch you teach the children of this territory. I want to sit on the porch when we're old and gray and remember the storm that brought you to me. I love you, Dorothy. I know it's soon, but I love you. The words hung in the air between them, and Dorothy felt something in her chest unfurl, like a flower opening to the sun. This was real. This was right. She didn't need more time or more certainty. She just needed to be brave enough to reach for it. I love you too, she said, and saw joy break across Xavier's face like sunrise. I love you, and I want all of that. The house, the life, the future. All of it. Xavier kissed her then, gentle at first and then deeper as she melted into him. It was her first real kiss, and it felt like coming home. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. We'll do this right, he said. I'll court you properly, and we'll get married as soon as we can arrange it. I want everyone to know you're mine and I'm yours. Dorothy laughed, a little giddy with happiness. That sounds perfect. They rode back to the ranch in a daze of joy, hands reaching for each other whenever their horses drew close. Back at the house, Xavier called his ranch hands together and announced, with obvious pride, that Dorothy had agreed to marry him. Pete Santos let out a whoop and the other hands clapped, offering congratulations. About time, boss, Pete said with a grin. We were wondering how long you two were going to dance around each other. Was it that obvious? Dorothy asked, blushing. Only to anyone with eyes, madam, Pete replied. You two have been looking at each other like you hung the moon since about day 3. That evening, Xavier and Dorothy sat down to write letters. One went to the school board in Albuquerque, explaining the situation and graciously withdrawing from the position. Another went to the priest in Sakura, requesting that he come to the ranch to perform a wedding ceremony. And a third went to the territorial government, announcing Xavier's intention to marry Dorothy Edwards of Boston, Massachusetts. We'll need to go into Sakura in a few days, Xavier said. Get you a proper dress, rings, whatever you need for the wedding. I don't need much, Dorothy said, just you. He smiled and pulled her close. You've got me, forever. The next week passed in a whirlwind of preparation. They rode into Sakura together, where Xavier insisted on buying Dorothy the finest dress available in the general store, a lovely cream-colored gown with lace trim. They ordered a pair of gold wedding bands from the jeweler, simple but beautiful. And Xavier introduced Dorothy to everyone they met, his pride evident in every word. The townspeople received the news with interest and approval. Several women offered to help with the wedding preparations, and the owner of the hotel insisted on providing a cake. Sheriff Dawson, hearing of the upcoming nuptials, stopped by to offer his congratulations. "Glad to see you found something good out of that terrible business with the stage," he told Dorothy. "Xavier's a fine man. You'll do well together." The wedding was set for 3 weeks hence, giving time for the banns to be read and for Xavier's more distant neighbors to receive word if they wanted to attend. In the meantime, Dorothy continued working on the garden, which was now flourishing. She'd also begun riding out with Xavier regularly, learning the land and the work of the ranch. Her hands grew more calloused and her skin tanned, but she'd never felt healthier or happier. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars come out, Xavier said, "I've been thinking about the new house." "Yes," Dorothy prompted. "I want to start work on it again after we're married, make it our project together. That way it'll truly be ours, not just something inherited but something we built." He took her hand. "What do you think?" "I think that's perfect," Dorothy said. "I can't wait to see it finished. It'll have a big kitchen for you and a parlor for your books and bedrooms for all the children we're going to have." Xavier's voice was warm with contentment. "All the children," Dorothy teased. "How many are we planning?" "As many as God grants us," Xavier replied. "I want our home to be full of life and laughter. I want to give our children everything my parents gave me: love, security, a connection to the land." "That sounds wonderful," Dorothy said softly, imagining it. Children running through the house, learning to ride, helping with the garden and the cattle. A full, rich life. The night before the wedding, Dorothy stayed at the hotel in Sakaro at the insistence of the women who'd befriended her. It was tradition, they said, for the bride and groom to spend the night before apart. Dorothy found it difficult to sleep, too excited for the morning. She kept thinking about Xavier, about the life they were going to build, about the incredible chain of events that had brought her here. If someone had told her 3 months ago that she'd be marrying a rancher in New Mexico territory, she would have laughed in disbelief. But life, she was learning, had a way of surprising you. The morning dawned clear and warm, perfect weather for a wedding. The women helped Dorothy dress, pinning up her hair and settling a borrowed veil over it. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she hardly recognized the woman staring back. She looked happy, glowing from within, utterly transformed from the frightened, mud-covered creature who'd stumbled out of the storm. The wedding was held in Sakaro's small church, with Father Miguel presiding. Xavier stood at the altar in his best suit, his hair neatly combed, looking handsome and nervous. When Dorothy walked down the aisle on Sheriff Dawson's arm, he'd kindly agreed to stand in for her late father. Xavier's face lit up with such love that she felt tears spring to her eyes. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. They spoke their vows in clear, firm voices, promising to love and honor each other for all their days. When Father Miguel pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier kissed Dorothy with tender reverence, and the small congregation erupted in applause. The celebration afterward was held at the hotel, with music and dancing and more food than seemed possible. Dorothy was introduced to people from all over the county, neighboring ranchers and their wives, shopkeepers, even a delegation of men from the pueblo who'd come to wish Xavier well. Everyone seemed genuinely happy for them, and Dorothy felt embraced by this community in a way she'd never experienced in Boston's more formal society. As the sun set and the party began to wind down, Xavier and Dorothy slipped away. They rode back to the ranch together, Xavier's arm around Dorothy's waist as she sat sideways on Thunder in front of him, the stars brilliant overhead. "Happy?" he asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Dorothy replied, leaning back against him. "Thank you for giving me this life, Xavier. Thank you for seeing me through the storm." "Thank you for staying," Xavier said. "For choosing this, choosing us. I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret it." They reached the ranch house to find it lit with lanterns, and Dorothy laughed in delight. Pete Santos and the other hands must have come ahead to prepare it for them. Inside, there were flowers in vases and fresh linens on the bed, and the kitchen table was laden with leftover food from the wedding. "They're good men," Xavier said. "They're happy for us." That night, as Xavier carried Dorothy over the threshold of what was now their home, she felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This was where she belonged, not because the storm had stranded her here, but because she'd chosen it. She'd chosen Xavier and this life and this land, and it had chosen her back. Their first months of marriage passed in a haze of joy. They fell into an easy partnership, working side by side during the day and falling into each other's arms at night. True to his word, Xavier had begun work on the new house, and every Sunday, their day of rest, they'd ride out to the site and work on it together. Dorothy learned to hammer nails and saw boards, while Xavier consulted her on every decision, from the placement of windows to the design of the porch. "This is your house too," he insisted. "I want you to love every inch of it." By fall, the house was taking real shape, and Dorothy discovered she was pregnant. Xavier's reaction when she told him was everything she could have hoped for: pure, unbridled joy. He picked her up and spun her around, whooping with delight, then immediately set her down and began fussing over whether she should be lifting anything or riding or working too hard. "I'm pregnant, not ill," Dorothy laughed. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time." But she loved his protective instincts, loved seeing him plan for their child's arrival. He built a cradle from cedar wood, his hands careful and sure. Dorothy sewed tiny garments and blankets, sitting by the fire in the evenings while Xavier read aloud to her. Sometimes she still thought about teaching, about the plans she'd once made, but she didn't regret her choice. There would be time for teaching later, once the baby was older. And Xavier had been serious about helping establish a school in the area. It was a project they were working on together, writing letters and gathering support. The baby, a boy they named Daniel, arrived on a cold February morning with the help of a midwife from Socorro. Xavier was beside himself with worry until he heard the baby's first cry, and when the midwife finally let him in to meet his son, he wept openly. "He's perfect," he breathed, holding the tiny bundle with shaking hands. "Dorothy, he's absolutely perfect." "We made him together," Dorothy said, exhausted but happy. "He's ours." Daniel was an easy baby, cheerful and healthy, and Xavier was a devoted father. Dorothy would often find him talking to the infant as he carried him around the ranch, explaining the cattle or the weather or whatever else came to mind. When Daniel began to smile and laugh, Xavier's whole face would light up in response. The new house was completed that summer, just in time for Daniel's first birthday. It was everything Dorothy had imagined and more spacious and well-built, with large windows that let in the light and a porch that wrapped around 3 sides. They held a gathering to celebrate both the house and Daniel's birthday, and half the county seemed to turn out. "Look what we built," Xavier said that night, standing with Dorothy on the new porch as they watched the last guests ride away. Daniel was asleep in his cradle inside, and the house smelled of fresh wood and new beginnings. A home, a family, a future. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Dorothy asked. "If the storm hadn't come that night, if I'd found someone else's ranch, if I'd gone on to Albuquerque." "All the time," Xavier admitted. "And every time I thank God for that storm. It brought me you." Over the next years, the Orion family continued to grow. A daughter, Lily, was born 2 years after Daniel, with her father's dark hair and her mother's blue eyes. Then came another son, James, and finally another daughter, Sarah, named after Xavier's mother Maria in Spanish tradition. The house that had once seemed so large was filled with the chaos and joy of children, with laughter and occasional tears, with muddy boots and toys scattered across the floor. Dorothy did eventually establish her school, holding classes 3 days a week in Sakaro for the area's children. Xavier built her a small schoolhouse on their land, and some of the more isolated families would bring their children to stay with Dorothy during the week so they could attend. She loved teaching, loved sharing her passion for learning, but she loved coming home to her family even more. The ranch prospered under Xavier's careful management and Dorothy's keen business sense. She'd taken over the bookkeeping and proved to have a talent for numbers and negotiation. They added more acres, improved their breeding stock, and became known throughout the territory as fair employers and good neighbors. Through it all, the love between Xavier and Dorothy only deepened. They'd been tested by challenges: hard winters, summer droughts, times when money was tight and the work seemed endless. But they faced everything together, their partnership unshakable. On their 20th wedding anniversary, they rode out to the rise where Xavier had first confessed his love. The original ranch house still stood, now used for storage, but it was the new house below that drew the eye, a thriving homestead surrounded by gardens and outbuildings, with horses in the corrals and cattle dotting the hills beyond. "You ever regret it?" Xavier asked, the same question Dorothy had once posed to him. "Giving up your plans, staying here?" Dorothy turned to her husband, this man who'd given her shelter in a storm, and then given her a life beyond her wildest dreams. His hair was threaded with silver now, and there were deeper lines around his eyes, but he was still the same Xavier who'd pulled her from the mud all those years ago. "Not for a single moment," she said, and meant it with all her heart. "You gave me a home, Xavier. Not just a place to live, but a real home. A family, a purpose, a life filled with meaning. That storm was the best thing that ever happened to me." Xavier pulled her close, kissing her with the same tender passion he'd shown on their wedding day. "You were the best thing that ever happened to me," he said. "My Dorothy, my love, my partner in all things." They stood there together as the sun set over their land, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. Below them, their children were playing in the yard: Daniel, now a young man helping his father run the ranch; Lily, following in her mother's footsteps as a teacher; James, with his father's love of horses and the land; and little Sarah, still finding her way. This was the life they'd built, Dorothy reflected. Not the life she'd planned, but something infinitely better. She'd been stranded by a storm, given shelter by a kind rancher, and found that shelter had become a home in every sense of the word. And as Xavier took her hand, and they rode down together toward the house and the family waiting for them, Dorothy sent up a silent prayer of thanks for every twist of fate that had brought her here. For the storm that had seemed like disaster but was really deliverance. For Xavier, who'd seen her at her lowest and offered not just shelter but his heart. For this land that had seemed so foreign and now felt like the only place she could ever truly belong. The storm had passed long ago, but its gift remained: a love that had weathered all seasons, a family that had grown from 2 people to 6, a home built on faith and hard work and devotion. As they dismounted in front of the house and their children came running out to greet them, Dorothy looked at Xavier and saw her entire world reflected in his eyes. She was home. She would always be home, and it was more than she'd ever dared to dream. Years continued to pass in the gentle rhythm of ranch life. Daniel married a girl from Sakaro, a bright young woman named Alina who loved the ranch life as much as he did, and they gave Xavier and Dorothy their first grandchildren, twin boys who were the light of their grandparents' lives. Lily moved to Santa Fe to teach at a larger school but came home every summer, filling the house with stories of city life while admitting she missed the vast skies and quiet of the ranch. James took over much of the day-to-day running of the cattle operation, showing the same intuitive understanding of the land and animals that his father had. And Sarah, their youngest, surprised everyone by announcing at 18 that she wanted to study medicine. Xavier and Dorothy scraped together the money to send her to a women's medical college back east, proud beyond measure of her ambition and determination. Through it all, Xavier and Dorothy remained each other's constants. They still took rides together whenever they could steal the time, still sat on the porch in the evenings talking or reading or simply being together. Their love had matured and deepened, becoming something rich and complex, built on shared history and mutual respect, and a devotion that had only grown stronger with time. On their 30th anniversary, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. Daniel and Alina with their 4 children now, Lily with her new husband, James with a girl he was courting, and Sarah, home from medical school for the summer, regaling them all with tales of her studies. The house Dorothy and Xavier had built together was filled to bursting with family, with love, with life. That evening, after everyone else had gone to bed, Xavier and Dorothy sat on their porch as they had countless times before. The land stretched out before them, bathed in moonlight, peaceful and eternal. "I was thinking today about that storm," Xavier said quietly. "The one that brought you to me, 31 years ago now, seems like yesterday and a lifetime all at once." "I remember every moment of it," Dorothy said. "How scared I was, how lost, and then seeing the light from your window." She squeezed his hand. "You saved my life that night, Xavier." "No," he said gently. "You saved mine. I was just existing before you came, going through the motions. You gave me purpose, gave me joy. You made this house a home and turned my solitary life into something beautiful." Dorothy felt tears prick her eyes, even after all these years, moved by his words. "We saved each other then, and built something that will outlast us." They looked out at the land they'd spent their lives caring for, at the house they'd built, at the legacy they'd created. Their children and grandchildren would carry on the work they'd begun, would tend this land and pass it down to their own children someday. The Orion name would endure, and with it, the love story that had started with a storm and a stranger's kindness. As they sat together in the moonlight, Xavier began to hum, then sing softly a Spanish lullaby his mother had taught him long ago. Dorothy leaned against him, listening to his voice, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her shoulder. This, she thought, was happiness. Not the wild passion of new love, though they'd had that too. Not the excitement of building something new, though they'd experienced that many times over. This was the deep, abiding contentment of a life well lived, of promises kept and love sustained through every trial and triumph. The years that followed brought their share of sorrow too. Pete Santos, who'd been with Xavier since the beginning, passed away peacefully in his sleep, and they mourned the loss of their loyal friend. Dorothy's health began to falter as she entered her 70s, and Xavier nursed her through a difficult bout of pneumonia that left her weakened. But she recovered, and they celebrated her 75th birthday with the whole family gathered once more. Sarah returned to New Mexico after completing her medical training, setting up a practice in Socorro, and riding out to the ranch regularly to check on her parents. She never married, devoted to her work and her patients, but she was fulfilled and happy. James married his sweetheart and took over the ranch completely now, running it with the same care and dedication his father had shown. Daniel's children were growing up strong and capable, already learning to work the land. And through it all, Xavier and Dorothy remained together, their love the foundation on which their entire family was built. One spring evening, when Dorothy was 78 and Xavier 81, they took one final ride together out to the rise where Xavier had first told her he loved her. It was harder now, their bodies not as strong as they once were, but Xavier insisted on saddling the horses himself and helping Dorothy mount. They rode slowly, savoring every moment, drinking in the beauty of the land they'd spent their lives nurturing. When they reached the top of the rise, they dismounted and stood looking out over the valley, over the house and the outbuildings and the cattle dotting the hillsides. "I would do it all again," Xavier said quietly. "Every moment, every choice that led me to you." "As would I," Dorothy replied. "You kept your promise, you know. You made sure I never regretted staying." "You kept yours too," Xavier said. "You gave me everything: love, family, a life richer than I ever imagined possible." They stood in silence for a long moment, hand in hand, two people who'd somehow found each other in the vastness of the New Mexico territory and built something that would echo through generations. "Thank you," Dorothy said finally. "Thank you for seeing me that night, for opening your door, for giving me shelter." "Thank you for staying," Xavier replied, "for turning that shelter into a home." As the sun set over their land one more time, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Xavier and Dorothy Orion stood together and knew they had lived well. They had loved deeply and built lasting things. They had weathered storms, both literal and metaphorical, and their love had proven stronger than all of them. When Xavier passed away peacefully in his sleep, 2 years later at the age of 83, Dorothy held his hand and whispered words of love and gratitude. She mourned him deeply, but also celebrated the incredible life they'd shared. And when she joined him a year after that, slipping away quietly in the house they'd built together, their children and grandchildren gathered to remember not just two lives but a love story that had become family legend. The ranch continued on, passed down through the generations, each one adding their own chapter to the story. But it all traced back to that storm-swept night in 1878, when a frightened woman saw a light in the darkness, and a lonely rancher opened his door. What began as shelter became a home. What started as kindness became love, and what seemed like disaster became the greatest blessing of two lives well lived. Daniel's great-grandchildren would grow up hearing the story of how their great-great-grandmother Dorothy had come to the Triple O Ranch in a storm, how Xavier had taken her in, and how their love had built the foundation of everything the family had become. It was a story of courage and compassion, of taking chances and building something lasting. It was a reminder that sometimes the storms that seem to destroy us are actually delivering us to exactly where we're meant to be. And on quiet evenings, when the New Mexico wind whispered through the valley and the stars blazed overhead, people said you could still feel the love that Xavier and Dorothy had built, woven into the very fabric of the land, enduring and eternal. A testament to the power of opening your door to a stranger and opening your heart to the possibility of home.